We're there. I just don't know if we're good on YouTube Live. If someone could tell me if YouTube Live is working, and then we'll get on the road. You are a great warm-up act, Steve. All right, I'm gonna take you on the road with me. Welcome to What Christ Suffered. You know, it's Easter week, so maybe it's a little late, but you might enjoy it anyway. Tonight I get to tell you a few of my favorite things from this book. If I were to tell you everything that's in the book, it would be like a Lord of the Rings movie marathon. Maybe enjoyable, but really long. This is the initial part of a weekend we have for pre-med and other healthcare professional students called MedCon 2021. This was hatched in Napa, California with your good president, Steve Minnis. Nearly 2 years ago, we thought of this idea. We were supposed to do it last year, and then this little worldwide health problem came up, sadly. It's also being streamed, they tell me, on YouTube Live tonight. And the story begins here in Rochester, Minnesota, southeast Minnesota. I was in medical school there after college, spent a lot of time in this little building studying in this hall. But since I didn't have enough to do, Monday nights I went to Resurrection Catholic Parish my first year and taught 6th grade religious education. And during Lent of my first year of medical school, I wanted to teach the students something about what Christ suffered. And so it's like, who am I going to ask, to kind of unpack this from a medical viewpoint? My classmates knew I was looking for somebody, and they said, Tom, go ask Dr. William Edwards. He was our pathology instructor, so what the heck? I went up after class, he's up at the podium. Dr. Edwards, I heard you might be able to give me some information on what Jesus went through from a medical perspective when he was crucified. Yeah, I could. Would you bring me something? Sure, I'll have something for you tomorrow, Tom. So the next day after class, I go up to him. Did you remember me, Dr. Edwards? Oh, yes. And he handed me this article. It's like, all right, the title, On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. Well, you nailed the topic, Doc. And then I looked at the date, and the date was for the following week. This is pre-internet. How does he have something from the following week? And then I looked at the first author, William Edwards. Oh, you wrote it. They sent this to you. I see, yeah. They had things called reprints back then. They'd send you this box with a stack of them in there. So it wasn't my idea that I got roped into this, but in the article, he gives kind of his understanding of what Jesus went through with his crucifixion as a sort of historical autopsy. Dr. Edwards is a cardiac pathologist, so he studies diseases of the heart after people die. So during my medical school required surgery semester, I did my research with him. I even was able to get my name on my first publication, but he let me share his information he had on the crucifixion, including this book by Dr. Pierre Barbet. He was a French surgeon. In 1950, he wrote this book, which has become famous in some circles, called The Doctor at Calvary. And for 20 years around the country, and even in other countries, I gave presentations until I started reading the work of this man, Frederick Zugaby, and others. He was a medical examiner in Rockland County, Long Island, New York. And he did some research, even some studies on the best medical research subjects ever. You know who they are? Medical students. Most world research is done on medical students first. I read articles he wrote, I read this book, and I said to myself, for 20 years, I've been teaching a lot of things that don't make sense medically. So I actually stopped giving talks for 10 years. And then in 2015, my friend Matthew Bunson, who was at EWTN, he was at Our Sunday Visitor, and he's also chairman of Dean of Faculty at Catholic Distance University. He said, Tom, I'd like you to write a course on this for our students. Well, okay. And so I figured if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. And so there was this article put up by the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine back in 2006. And in it, these two authors kind of poo-poo all these doctors who have written articles on the crucifixion because they were actually not very well done. It's been an axiom I've seen that a lot of people, they give their best at their job, but when it comes to anything church-related or religion-related, it's like any effort is good enough. And I wanted something to be excellent with this. So I took everything they said was wrong with the other articles, and I took them as marching orders. One of them, they said, no one has gone back into the ancient history to see what was really happening. Has anybody looked at the history? So as I was searching all these Greek and Latin sites for the classics, out comes this book by John Granger Cook. He was my new best friend. 540-page book on crucifixion in the Mediterranean world. How many of you have this on your bookshelves? Exactly. who would read it? I devoured it. He did an awesome job. And so I wrote this course. It was about 500 hours of work over a couple of years, called Another Doctor at Calvary, paying some credit to Dr. Pierre Barbet, who really got people interested in this topic. And then I just let it sit there. I think 12 or 13 people probably took the course, so all that work didn't go very far. But then a friend of mine, Our Sunday Visitor, OSV, it's a Catholic publishing house in Huntington, Indiana, asked me if I would write a book. And I told, I'd had people for years telling me, oh, you should write a book on this. Writing a book is a lot of work. It's more than a term paper, believe it or not. So I said, well, have your editorial people contact me if it really think it might interest them. And so they said, well, write an introductory chapter. So I spent an hour, wrote an introductory chapter, just sent it to them. They liked it. So another 200 hours worth of work, and here's the book. But I wanted to do something that other authors haven't done. I wanted to make it more than just about medicine. I want it to be about history, but I also want it to be about suffering, how to understand it better. And suffering particularly because of, remember Sesame Street? This episode is brought to you today by the number 0. Because 0 was exactly how many hours of time I spent in medical training learning about suffering. And why do patients come? Because they're suffering. You'd think we would learn about it, but no. So I had written a course at my bishop's urging years earlier for physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals. And also to try to understand what the heck was St. Paul thinking when he wrote Colossians 1:24, where he says, I make up what is lacking in the sufferings of the Christ for the sake of his body, that is the church. Really? Lacking? Are you kidding me? So, if he, and he also says in there, he considers that he can turn his sufferings into joy. If he can turn suffering into joy, he's figured out how to take the worst thing in the world to turn it into the best thing in the world. He's come up with something better than room temperature fusion, something better than a perpetual motion machine, you physicists, you know all about those, or a car that runs on air. What the heck is in the black box that turns suffering into joy? Because if we can do this as human beings, I mean, this is better than just about anything else we could come up with. Stay tuned. We're going to get to that point. But first, the garden. The Garden of Gethsemane, sometime between 9 and midnight, and the date, almost certainly April 3rd, AD 33. And why do I say almost certainly? Oh, you're just guessing. Well, Jimmy Akin, Catholic Answers, and then there's articles by guys who are archaeoastronomists. Now, I bet you don't have that major here, but there's people who actually call themselves that. So they try to figure out the exact dates that things happen in history. Well, it's not too hard when you use the Gospels. They give us everything we need to know, because we know what year the Word of God came to John the Baptist in the wilderness, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. So that was about AD 29. We know when Pontius Pilate was governor, like 26 to 36 AD. And we know that the Passover that year started on a Friday. And we know how the Jews have always determined when Passover is, so we know what date Passover started for every year of any century. And then we know what? We know that the only 2 years that Friday was the beginning of the Passover was AD 30 and 33 during the time of Pontius Pilate. And we further know from the Gospel of John, Jesus celebrated at least how many different Passovers in Jerusalem? At least 3. You can't get 3 Passovers from 29 to 30, so it has to be AD 33. So on April 3rd, it typically gets down to around 50 degrees in Jerusalem on average. So there he is. These are the olive trees there now in Gethsemane. And of course, Gethsemane means, a place of crushing. It's where they would crush the olives. These trees are about 1,000 years old, probably grew over the site of where previous trees that might have been there at Jesus' time. And this is the rock of agony, which is believed to be the place where Jesus prayed and sweat blood that night. And adorning the rock of agony is my favorite raven on our trip to the Holy Land in 2018. Oh, don't turn red, Monica. It's okay. So I've been to the Holy Land now 3 times, and one of the things that impresses me the most about the Holy Land is how small and compact Jerusalem is. So the first question I want to address medically, did Jesus sweat blood? When I see what Luke wrote, that and praying in earnest, his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground, I think of this. Somebody that has had a hematoma, bleeding under their skin, and you open it up and you get these globs of somewhat clotted blood. So Luke uses terms that suggest hematidrosis, bloody sweat. Hemata is the prefix referring to blood, like hematology, and then drosis is a suffix referring to sweat, or anhidrosis would be the absence of sweat. It's a medical condition. This is one patient with hematidrosis. It's fascinating. From 1964 to 2004, there's no reports in medical literature about bloody sweat. There were many before 1964. So I started to think, is this really a thing? But then from around the world have come now over 30 reports from all continents of patients with bloody sweat. And it often happens like this. The blood just starts coming out of the skin. And what's even more fascinating is it can even happen where there are no sweat glands. Tear ducts, the tongue, under the fingernails. This is the palm of the woman shown in the first picture. She had just had bloody sweat, and what you'll notice on the palm is that there's no opening that you can see. And when people get this, half of them, the first symptom is blood leaking out of their skin. They have absolutely no symptoms. Dr. Pierre Barbet said it's only in extreme emotional duress. Not the case. Half of patients have anxieties of some type, or problems like bad headaches, bad belly pain, or exhaustion, or excess heat. What's amazing is there's never a sign of trauma. There's never an opening scene. And these little things here are called petechiae, like little baby bruises. You never see them. I cannot explain, as a dermatologist who looks under the microscope at skin every day, how blood is getting out of the blood vessels, out of the skin, and there's never any at all left in the skin. Doesn't make any sense. So there's still a lot of mystery about this. This is a biopsy through the middle layer of skin. The middle layer of skin is called the dermis. It's mainly made up of collagen. So that's this pink stuff here. And you best know collagen as leather. Leather is really collagen from a cow. That's what makes the skin strong. But also in that layer of skin, there are the sweat glands and then blood vessels. And you notice there's a number of cell layers in between and the collagen protein. Dr. Barbet in his book said that in hematidrosis, the blood vessels burst and mixed with sweat in the sweat glands. But his book didn't have a reference to support it. And I don't see how that happens. I don't see how that could happen. Those are the sweat glands. Those are the blood vessels. This is our patient again. She was 18. She had headaches and abdominal pain when she had this happen. Biopsy was done on her. And what does the biopsy show? Just a little bit of swelling in the skin. But the biopsy was done in an area of bleeding after the bleeding had stopped. And every time they've done that, taken a sample of skin, it doesn't give us any clues. But one biopsy was done during on a 13-year-old girl in Thailand. And this is a scalp, and you can see here this moisture. That's the blood coming out around the hair follicles. So fortunately, they did this one during. And they took this little, it's like a pencil eraser sized plug. They cut through it about 6 micrometers at a time, and they put all those little slices on microscope slides. And what did they see? They saw this. So this is the epidermis, the top layer of skin that renews itself every day. And then this is the dermis, and this is mostly just collagen, not individual cells, just collagen. There's a space here, and in the space are a few blood cells. And then as they go on, the space got bigger, and there's more red and white blood cells in there, until finally, oh, look at this. This is right next to where a hair comes out. The skin just splits open. It's kind of like the Red Sea. It's like, what is going on here? I mean, it's not through a blood vessel. And then afterwards, it just closes up like it never happened. I don't have a good answer to what's going on there. Now, I do know that in states of inflammation, say you have an infection in the skin, your blood vessels do get bigger, and they actually get leaky so that white blood cells can squeeze out of the blood vessels, get in the tissue, and fight the bacteria. That's normal. So that makes sense. And that can happen when there's adrenaline. But why does this happen? I still don't have an answer. We do know that adrenaline is responsible for it. And adrenaline is that energy your body gives you for the fight or flight response when you have a physical challenge you have to meet. And now even an emotional challenge. And we know that any of these patients described around the world, when they take a beta blocker, like propranolol, which blocks the effects of adrenaline, the bloody sweat stops. The bleeding stops. So what we learned from these reports is that, yes, there is blood and sweat on the skin in these people, but the blood and sweat mix outside the body, not inside the body. Now, tonight at dinner, some of us were asked what our favorite Bible story was, or Bible passage. And my new one, after researching the book, is the Garden of Gethsemane, and here's why. It has to do with adrenaline, which is a God-given power given to all of us to succeed. But in anxiety, we translate that adrenaline as negative. Yes, we see adrenaline as something that's not so good when it's really meant for good. So how can we take a negative state like anxiety or fear? And we know Jesus had that in the garden. What did he pray to his Father? Father, let this cup pass from me, if you will. I mean, he knew what was going to happen to his body. Any rational person would fear that. So how do we take anxiety or fear, which we see as a negative, and transform it into something that's positive? Something which is actually in psychology called flow. And this has changed my life. And I want to point out, in the Garden of Gethsemane, there are 3 high adrenaline states that Jesus experiences. Anxiety, hematidrosis, and then flow. Talking about flow is something that's been around forever in human beings. But we only started talking about it in the 90s. Why? Because up until then, psychiatry and psychology focused on mental illness. Well, then psychologists started saying, well, instead of focusing on the negative stuff, why don't we focus on what is it that makes people happy? So there's this huge area called positive psychology, and it's just fascinating. Flow came out of his research with people who were operating at an optimal level in their chosen field as human beings. What made them so good? And when they were doing their best something, they were often in the arts or sports, they would describe it as being, I'm just in the zone. I'm all there, totally focused in the present moment. And of course, we know, just living in the present moment, it's sacramental. It says so in Abandonment to Divine Providence by Jean-Pierre de Caussade. But flow is when we're operating at our best, when all 120 bits per second that our brains can process are focused on one thing. So how can we take adrenaline, how can we do it, and look at it as anxiety or threat and turn it into an opportunity? Or how can we see a challenge before us and use that adrenaline to see it as an opportunity for growth? And when we say for growth as Christians, what are we talking about? For virtue, for holiness, for love, an opportunity for all those things. And this is a 3-step paradigm that Jesus illustrates that I learned from a psychiatrist at Harvard. And these 3 steps are called reframing, being mindful in silence, and then taking on the challenge. Dr. Kevin Majors is that psychiatrist. He's been on our radio show multiple times. He's one of our favorite guests that people like to download and listen to. He's won the Excellence in Teaching Award at Harvard Medical School. And he's an Opus Dei numerary. I mean, he is a committed Catholic. And he said on our most recent show that we did with him, he said, the universe is not optimized for our pleasure. It is optimized for our growth. In other words, every challenge we face is an opportunity to grow in holiness, to become, as Matthew Kelly says, the best versions of ourselves. So the first step is reframing, which means changing your thinking, which is the root of where metanoia comes from, and now metanoia has a broader meaning for Christians. But one way to change your thinking is anxiety really means excitement. Excitement we view positively, right? As an example, all right, the second most commonly used group of study participants after med students are college students. So in this study, they did a karaoke competition, and they split the students into 3 groups. One group was supposed to tell themselves, I am anxious. One group was supposed to tell themselves, I'm excited. And one group wasn't supposed to tell themselves anything before they did the test. And the test was graded on what % of time were you singing the right pitch. What do you think happened? That happened. The middle, most on pitch, I am excited. Least on pitch, I am anxious. The silent group was in between. And they've done other studies, 2 groups of students taking the same class right before a test. And they'll go in right before the test to one group and say, you're anxious now and nervous, that's really meant to help you do better. The other group, they won't do anything. Reliably, the group they told that to does better. So the adrenaline is there for our good. And it's driven by the activity in the amygdala, this little almond-shaped thing that's on either side of the brain. It's our threat detection center. That's what sends us those messages of fear when we're about to face a challenge. So in reframing, we take a challenge and look at it as an opportunity. Now, what did Jesus do? His initial thing, he's thinking, this is going to hurt. Father, if you would, let this pass from me. But how does he reframe it? Not my will, but yours be done. He sees it as an opportunity. What? Opportunity for our salvation. Also, according to Hebrews 12:2, an opportunity for joy. In other words, Jesus says, bring it on. That is the essential message of the reframing. That's the first step. But what's the second step? You don't just go from there into it. There's an intermediary. And mindfulness really just harnesses the power of silence. Because all mindfulness is silent awareness. It's not emptying the mind. So oftentimes when we have a worry about something we're going to face, we wrestle that worry and try to rationalize it to the ground. It never works. Just like pulling on a Chinese finger trap, you never get out of it that way. Have any of you ever tried this? The more you pull, the tighter it gets. You have to release your grip on it for it to fall off. Most Westerners don't realize that our mind does two major things. Most people think our minds only do one thing, and that's think. But there's another thing our minds are meant to do, and that's to just be aware. Yeah, it's adorable, isn't it? And this slide kind of sums it up. Most of the time, our minds are full. We're either thinking of the past, rehashing, judging, or the future, worrying or planning. So this guy is everywhere except, his mind is everywhere except where his body is. The dog is just where the dog is. Okay? So good example, being mindful is just aware of where you are and what's going on. Sometimes we just have to observe what's going on with us at that moment and stop thinking. So, and sometimes what's helpful, and they've shown it, is just even deep breaths, especially in through your nose. This sounded radical until I, saw the research. And that is, if you breathe in through your mouth, which we tend to do when we're anxious, it actually drives the left side of our brain to be more active than the right side. Now, the left side, the logical side, is really supposed to be the servant of the right side, which kind of has the big picture of life. In fact, Dr. Majors says that atheism is actually hemi-neglect of the right side of the brain. It's people who are living in the left side of their brains too much. When we breathe in through the left side of our brain, actually the activity of both sides is in balance, and the right side has the left side serving it instead of the left side trying to take control. So we're more in control. So when we are feeling the pain of the moment, and I went through 30 years of medical treatment for anxiety that I got off during the pandemic because of some of the things I've learned here. And the only thing I learned until I got in contact with Dr. Majors and a couple other doctors this year to help me get off those medicines was from a counselor who told me very early on, sometimes, Tom, you just have to feel the pain. And that's what mindfulness is just feeling where you are instead of trying to run from it. In other words, hug the cactus. And how did Jesus do that in the garden? Did he try to run from his anxiety? No. He was living in that present moment, experiencing his fear to the point that what? It bled out of his skin. But that then tells your amygdala, oh, I told you there was a threat. You get it. Good. Message received. And the amygdala stops pumping out all the extra adrenaline and fear. And so that you can calm down and then take on the challenge. Now, sometimes, how do I exercise this at work? Say I know there's a patient in a room who's upset with me or just upset. I'll say, instead of, oh no, how am I going to get out of there, which, would be a reflex, I'll think, this is an opportunity for me to love this patient and help them through this. And I might just take a breath in and say, yep, I'm afraid, but that's okay. That's going to help me do better. Then go in and do it. So it can be that short a period of time, but it can help us to conquer many challenges in our life. Hebrews 12:2, Jesus, who for the joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame, to sit down at the right hand of the throne of God. And what you'll notice if you go through the Passion narratives in the Gospels, He is completely different after the bloody sweat. Even the betrayal in the garden, it's like he is above the whole situation. He's watching actors around him. He's calm, in control, regal, just incredible. And this is something we can do every day. It's something I do every day. Every day I use this paradigm because my frame, first thing when my feet hit the floor, I will accept and bear with submission today, Lord, whatever suffering you send me for love of you, conversion of sinners, and reparation for sins committed against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. That's my frame. That's where I put myself. Everything that happens today is an opportunity. And then I spend 15 minutes in silent awareness. And there's many different ways we can do this. There's even a Catholic book on mindfulness. A lot of people who fear mindfulness thinks it means emptying the mind. It's not. It's just using the mind to observe in silence, not to be empty. And then finally, take on the challenge. And I get some extra chemicals going in my body, so the next thing I do is exercise. Because if every day, if at least every other day, every 48 hours, you do at least 10 minutes of exercise where you have 3 30-second sprints, either running, elliptical, biking, it releases so much BDNF and ANF, which are released from the heart and the brain, that you actually think better and do better on tests. And that's why my homeschooled sons who are still at home, they do that 3 times a week. And if you're interested in this at all, Dr. Majors has podcasts called The Golden Hour at Optimal Work, number 47, 20-minute podcast. It changed my life. I got off of drugs after 30 years for anxiety. And it's shown that doing this actually shrinks your amygdala. 20% of the population suffers from anxiety. All right, Jesus showed us how to deal with that. What happens to him next after the garden? This is a picture I took from the Mount of Olives. Remember the picture I showed in the Garden of Gethsemane? This is taken from there. And what you can see is there's a valley right here. Those are all graves. So there are certain Jewish sects who believe that Jesus, the Messiah, is going to come, and they're going to be taken up from there. It's like they have a front row seat to the Messiah. And they pay big bucks to be buried there. But this is the old walled city of Jerusalem. This is where the Temple Mount was. But the house of Annas would have been here. The house of Caiaphas, where he is taken, he spends basically like from 1 to 6 in the morning there. And he's in a place that they refer to in Jerusalem as the pit. Until my first time in Jerusalem in 2014, I didn't even know about this place. It's called St. Peter in Gallicantu. Gallicantu means cock crow, because that's where the cock crowed twice after Peter had denied Jesus. It's a French Dominican monastery there. And it's a place where Jesus suffered that night. And according to the Gospels, they spat on Jesus, they struck him with an open palm, they punched him with their fist, they blindfolded and said, "Who is it that struck you? Prophesy." And then Luke has another word. It's a Greek word, durantes, and the D-E-R is the same as the prefix for dermis or dermatology, referring to the skin. And that referred to a more severe beating of the skin. In fact, there is a tradition in the Holy Land that Jesus was actually beaten at 2 different pillars. And one of them was a scourging with Pilate, but another one would have been in the pit and beaten in various ways. And one way that is likely, there was something that the Romans used called a virga, or a switch, or it could have just been thin sticks or branches from trees, and the Jews might have done the same thing. And in fact, on the Shroud of Turin, there are some marks on there that kind of match what that would have been. So that is another thing that might have happened. We don't know for sure, but we do know that he was kept there overnight, awake, without friends or food. This is a mosaic on the outside of St. Peter in Gallicantu, and it shows kind of a truss of ropes around him. Why? To lower him into the pit. Here is the opening from above to the pit, and here's the opening from in the pit looking up. And you can climb down there now. They built stairs, but there wouldn't have been stairs down there. And what they're reading is Psalm 88. And it talks about being alone and abandoned in the pit. And I'm behind on my Bible in a Year podcast. So yesterday I listened to Psalm 88. And as Father Mike pointed out, it's the only psalm that does not end on a note of hope. I didn't realize that till I heard that. So Jesus is taken at daybreak, not after waking up because he never got to sleep, to a mock trial in the temple, and then from there he's taken to Herod, to Pilate, who would have been staying at Herod's palace, contrary to what was thought until the 90s, when research shown that clearly even contemporaries of first century AD wrote that the Roman governor would stay at Herod's palace. Why? Well, because Herod Antipas was actually subordinate to Pilate. So why would Pilate stay at the fortress of Antonia, this ugly military barracks next to the temple, when he could stay at the nice digs in town? And indeed, that's what was done. And if you noticed, on Palm Sunday, we read the Gospel from Mark. And there, when Jesus goes before Pilate, it says he went to the palace, that is the praetorium. A lot of people don't notice it even says palace. Nobody would have confused the fortress of Antonia with a palace. And so you can visit that place today. The last time I was in Jerusalem, I finally got to visit and see where they've unearthed the foundations for Herod's palace. And this is on the west side of the walled city. This is the Tower of David complex. And underneath this building, which was an Ottoman-era Turkish jail, they have found the stone. So when you enter the door, this is the excavations going on. And these large blocks here, those are the foundation stones from the time when Herod the Great built that. And in Jerusalem, they have a scale model of Jerusalem as it looked at the time of Christ. And this is traditionally where they thought that Pilate would have stayed. But this is the tower, the Herod's palace complex, multiple buildings. It also explains from the Gospels how it was easy and relatively quick for Pilate to send Jesus to Herod and Herod back to Pilate without taking a lot of time. If they had to go all the way across town, it would have taken much longer than just building to building like this. The scourging, which would have occurred here. In fact, it's thought someone's discovered in Jerusalem the area right outside this wall. And in fact, when I'm in Jerusalem, I run around the old walled city every day. So I probably run across the spot where they believe Jesus was presented and scourged. How was he scourged? Why was he scourged? Because even at the time of Philip of Macedon, 3rd century, 4th century BC, scourging was a normal preliminary to crucifixion. And most people that were crucified were actually scourged while they were carrying their crosses. We know that's not the case with Jesus, and we'll get into that. Because the Romans had 3 types of flesh beating. The first one was called fustigatio, or chastisement. If you look at Luke's gospel, it's pretty clear that Pilate initially intended the scourging to be all of the punishment. And in fact, last Good Friday, in John's gospel, Jesus is presented after the scourging to the people before making the calling for his execution. So that was initially what was called for. Then there was another one called flagellatio. This is what they would do to people if they wanted to get a confession out of them. Yeah, it was really good. And then there was verberatio, like reverberation. This is what referred to the preliminary for crucifixion. So it was probably done mid-morning sometime. In what position was Jesus when he was scourged? If you tell me, we'll both know. Because I have tried to find out. Nobody knows. In Malta, they sure have a lot of statues in their churches of different ways. So this was one suggestion, another suggestion, and yet another one, which is kind of the classic way I've always pictured it. The closest I can come in Acts, it talks about the Apostle Paul being beaten, and it says he's just stretched out, which makes it sound like this position. We just don't know. What was the scourge weapon like? Well, in the article that Dr. Edwards wrote, the medical illustrator drew this: a wooden handle, leather straps, and then pieces of lead balls and ankle bone of sheep. The problem is, as my research has found, and as another line of evidence shows, only Greek scourges had the pieces of bone. The Romans only had the little lead balls on them. And in fact, other evidence, these have been found in the catacombs. The Vatican has them. I'd love to get better pictures, but it's hard to get through the Vatican. But nevertheless, they're made of brass or bronze and have these lead weights at the end in pairs. And the Romans could strike somebody with them an unlimited number of times, whereas the Jews had a limit, the Romans didn't. So if we use the Shroud of Turin, which makes sense to me as being the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. You've got all these paired little wounds which match what has been found. And in fact, some of the outlines even kind of match these. How many times was Jesus struck? Oh, too many. But how severe would it have been? If the Shroud of Turin is his burial cloth, there's like at least 120 pairs of these marks. But the only marks that are shown are where there was bleeding. And certainly every time he was struck, it didn't cause bleeding because the skin had to be softened up first before it would release any blood. So it could have been a good 200 plus times he was struck with one of these paired weapons. And what would the effects of that be? Well, there would be bruising. So he's going to start to lose blood. And it doesn't matter if you lose the blood outside your body or inside your body. It's going to cause problems as long as it's no longer in your blood vessels or heart. You know, he's then going to have abrasions which become bleeding contusions like this. He's going to sweat profusely because he's in pain, because your body's going to start putting out adrenaline. What does adrenaline do? It shrinks the blood vessels, so it makes the blood pressure higher as he's losing blood, makes the heart beat harder to keep up with the needs of the body. But then, because it's going to strike his chest wall, there's a number of very sensitive nerves in the lining of bone, like on the ribs and where the ribs meet the cartilage. Not that any of his bones would necessarily have broken. In fact, Scripture said they didn't. But he's going to start shallow breathing. Why? Well, in one sense, it doesn't make sense because he needs more oxygen to keep up with the pain. But because of the swelling and pain in the bones and the fine nerves there, every time he expands his chest, those are on fire from the expansion. So he's got this catch-22. He needs to take deeper breaths to keep up with the oxygen needs for the pain and the loss of blood. Yet the more he does it, the more pain he has. And then he starts, so splinting means just taking shallow breaths and kind of holding your arms at your side so you don't breathe deep. He also gets acidosis. Carbon dioxide, acid builds up in the blood, which is also not healthy and can lead to organs not working well. The damage to the chest wall can lead to what's called a pleural effusion. That's when you get fluid here between the lungs and the chest wall. And as that fills up with fluid, the lungs can't expand as much. And finally, you might get contusions in the lung. This is a dog lung after an auto accident, but you get blood in the tissue. And finally, you get so lightheaded that you just pass out because of all the pain. Let's return for a little bit to unveiling kind of this mystery of what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Now, really, what's lacking in that? I can't think of anything until I read about John Paul II. And the solution is that Jesus Christ only suffered, died, and rose again in the body that he received through the womb of the Virgin Mary. But he wants to suffer and die and rise in each one of us. A radical idea, but I found so many people have written about it. Benedict XVI, John Paul have written about it. My favorite quote from the pandemic that I learned, Paul Claudel, French poet, he said, Christ didn't come into the world to get rid of suffering. He didn't even come into the world to explain suffering. He came into the world to suffer with us. Wow, because suffering is all about love. Even Sigmund Freud got it right when he said we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love. He got that right. The greatest love required the greatest suffering. The love that saved us required the death of God. And I learned in my suffering research that everything has a price, and that the price of love is suffering. But people want to know even more than that about suffering. They want it to mean something. And who better to go to? Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist, Jewish, spent time in Auschwitz and Dachau in World War II concentration camps. His wife died in Bergen-Belsen. And while he was there, he was writing a book, which is now a famous, excellent book. And he said, if there is meaning in life, then there must be meaning in suffering. And he tells this story. When he was a practicing psychiatrist after World War II, an elderly general practitioner came to him and said how much he was suffering due to the death of his wife of many years. And Dr. Frankl said, sir, what would have happened if you had preceded your wife in death? Oh, that would have been terrible. How deeply she would have suffered. She has been spared that suffering. but it is at the very real cost that you must suffer and mourn her. He didn't say anything to that, but he shook Dr. Frankel's hand, looked him in the eye, and then walked out. Because love transforms suffering into sacrifice and achieves redemption. And according to St. John Paul, that's the meaning of suffering: redemption, salvation. And because of this, there are therefore three corollaries that follow. The first corollary is because Christ's suffering has meaning, your suffering has meaning, my suffering has meaning. The second corollary is that because Christ's passion redeemed human beings, Christ's passion redeemed human suffering. It gave suffering meaning. So finally, because Christ suffered for our redemption, we can actually suffer for the redemption of other people. That sounds boring. It's the most profound superpower we have. We can change, we can effect eternity. We'll tie that up at the end, but we are here on the way to Calvary. Let's get on with the royal mocking. How was he punished by the guards? 4 different ways: the crown, the robe, the reed, and the homage. The crown. Along the side of the road in Galilee, in Judea today, you can see this plant, Ziziphus spina Christi. It's even named after the crown of thorns. My first trip there, I was able to finagle some with bloody fingers and get it back. The thorns are about ½ an inch long, but incredibly sharp. The scalp is under tension. You put something sharp in it, the scalp skin just pulls away. And because of the connective tissue in the scalp, the way it holds blood vessels open, when it's separated, like in loose skin, other places on your body, it will just close right up. But here it stays open and bleeds. The shape of the crown, yeah, they often draw these crowns with these incredibly long thorns. If you're a Roman soldier, you're not going to do something more complicated than necessary. So if they fashioned this beautiful circular crown, they would have cut themselves a lot. Evidence suggests that it was a cap of thorns, and the only evidence we really have to go by is if we use the Shroud of Turin, which shows blood coming from all over the scalp. But also thinking pragmatically like a soldier, he just put it on the way it's going to cause the greatest amount of pain. Well, then he's got a robe. Now, why is the robe a problem? Because of the scourging. Remember that bleeding? They first put his own robe on there, then they pull it off for the mocking, reopening the wounds. Then they put this new robe on there, and later they'll take that off again and put his new one on. And then right before the crucifixion, they'll take it off again. So 3 times drying there. I mean, just think of, a bloody wound on your knee with a piece of gauze on it, except much worse. Then the reed. I always thought, what's the big deal with the reed? I grew up near Lake Michigan, and people refer to the cattails there as reeds, these little flimsy things. No, that's not a reed. I was so wrong. This is the kind of reed that grows in the Middle East. It's called Arundo donax, and it's kind of like bamboo. Think of like a pool cue stick. It's like that heavy and weighted. That's what they struck him with. So that was part of the homage. They struck him with it. And where did they strike him? They struck his head. Oh, but what's on his head? The crown of thorns. So they're just driving it in more and more with each of those. So not only being battered with it, but also sliced on the scalp with it. And it is in this state that he's presented, in John's Gospel, ecce homo, behold the man. And he's condemned. So he has to travel the Via Dolorosa. What did he carry to Calvary? If you listened on Palm Sunday, Mark's Gospel, who did it say carried the cross? Anybody? Who was in church on Palm Sunday? What did Mark's Gospel say? Do we have any Christians in here? Who? Simon. Exactly. Who does Matthew say carry the cross? Simon. Who does Luke say carry the cross? Simon. Only John tells us that Jesus carried his cross. And believe me, all these neat little facts, I didn't come up with them. I read from much smarter people than me. It says in the Greek, he went out bearing his own storos. So the question is, what the heck is a storos? Is that a storos? Is that? Maybe this is. How about that log there? Is that a storos? All these different Jesus movies? Well, let's go back to the Greeks. How did the Greeks at the time of Christ use the word storos? It could mean either a pole or a two-part cross. So this fence, all those upright posts to a Greek, would be a stauros. First century, Plutarch wrote in his Moralia, every criminal who goes to crucifixion must carry his own stauros on his back. And also in the first century, a writer of the first romance, Theron, this is the male, he's suspended, crucified, in front of Callirrhoe's tomb, the female love interest. You can tell the first romance ends badly. And from his cross, from his stauros, he saw the sea. So from these, and there are many other excerpts, we can see a stauros could be carried. There's nothing in literature about it being dragged. And you could be suspended upon it. Well, the Romans had Latin terms related to crucifixion. One of them is patibulum. It's a wooden beam that comes from a verb meaning to stretch out. They also have the word crux, a pole or two-part cross. It could have either meaning, and that's where we get our English word cross. Plautus, first known writer of comedies, says that a criminal must carry a patibulum through the city, and then thereafter is attached to a crux. So we learn from that, as well as the closest thing we have to instructions for crucifixion. These were found in the 1950s, inscribed in a wall just west of Naples in Puteoli. It's called the Lex Puteolana, the law, and it's rules for undertakers. And the undertakers, at times, would create their own business. Yeah. So the undertaker exacts the punishment in this manner. If the owner, slave owner, wants to lead the patibulated individual to a crux. So somehow a patibulum is on a person, he's taken to a cross. So we learn a crux and a patibulum are two different things, that a patibulum is carried to a crux. How do the Greek and Latin words relate? We learn in the 5th century AD from the author Macrobius, provide us a little Rosetta Stone in this statement. Patibulum, that is stauros in Greek. So we learn that a patibulum or a stauros can be carried to a crux. There is nowhere in ancient writings, and there are dozens of examples, there is no example of carrying a two-part cross. Always the crossbar to an upright already in the ground. Well, how much did the cross weigh that he carried? Dr. Barbarian, a doctor at Calvary, says 75 to 100 pounds, but he had no reference for it. So I'm trying to think, how can we get at this? And the only way, because Catholics are kind of interesting people, we collect things that other religions don't collect. We like relics. So Constantine actually sent his mother to the Holy Land around 328 AD to find the relics of the crucifixion. And she's remembered for this. Where is this statue? Yeah, that's in St. Peter's Basilica. It's one of the 4 big statues. St. Veronica's there. I think St. Andrew's there. And she brought back the crossbar of the good thief. Yeah. Pars crucis boni latronis, part of the cross of the good thief. How big is it? It's about 6 feet long. It's about 5 by 2.5 inches. And it's made of European black pine, which interestingly, when they've tested samples, relics of the true cross, they're always made of European black pine. So, for you math-minded people in here, we have a volume we can figure out. We know the density of European black pine. You get a mass, which is a weight of about 15 pounds or a bowling ball. Now remember, what state is Jesus in? He's barely able to keep conscious because of the pain and the blood loss. So if you put something 6 feet long along him, even a 2x4, the 2x4 is going to weigh less than this weighed, 6 foot 2x4. It's not hard to imagine how he would fall. How far did Jesus carry the cross, and where? Well, I've shown you that the place where he was condemned was probably not at the corner of the temple, the Fortress of Antonia, which is on where we celebrate the Via Dolorosa. It's probably on the other side of the walled city, still about the same distance, about once around a track, about a quarter mile or 400 meters. And then he's crucified between noon and 3. How is he attached to the cross? They don't give us many details about crucifixion because it was known to the people of the time. This is the first religious image of Jesus crucified. Any guesses as to when that was made? What century? Second? Any other guesses? Yes. The year that he was crucified. If you go to the catacombs, there are no images of crucifixion. They are all of resurrection and of hope. This is from 420 AD. In other words, the person that carved this, it's part of an ivory reliquary box. The person that carved this never saw crucifixion because it was outlawed in the early 300s. Their parents never saw it. Their grandparents never saw one. So there was no eyewitness who could tell them what crucifixion looked like. We do know that nails were used because Thomas said, unless I put my finger in the nail print in his hand. So we know that nails were used, and the nail went in the hand. But to Greeks, the hand is composed of the palm, or palame, and the wrist, or carpos kerion. And still today, anatomically, the wrist is part of the hand. I discovered things I didn't know about, like the Alcamilla graffito. Alcamilla is a female name. This is a crucifixion depiction of a woman. While crucifixion was still going on in the Roman Empire. It's supposed to be from the back, and these stripes probably represent scourge marks. Right now, I'll use this image later, but right now I want you to notice this. What's the closest part to the crossbar? It's the wrist. Ancient seals all from the 3rd century, while crucifixion is still going on. The wrist is closest. And then the Shroud of Turin, the one place you see blood on the hands, it's in the wrist. So the place on the shroud would correspond to these locations, and always going between these bones, because Dr. Pierre Barbet did a helpful experiment on amputated arms. He took 12 of them, and he took in the mid-wrist and just anywhere in this area a nail. And every time it went through the bones like a funnel without breaking any of the bones. And this is what it would look like on a cadaver. Yeah. So that is most likely where the nail went. I'll get to that. How were his arms placed on the cross? Titus was general when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And writing about this was Flavius Josephus in his Wars of the Jews. And it says that at one point they were crucifying hundreds of people a day. One way, one another way, all in a way of jest. So there could have been multiple positions in which they were crucified. The question is, was there a standard? I think there was. One example is in the writings from the 100s of Lucian of Samosata, wrote this farce, Trial in a Court of Vowels. The vowels are putting all the consonants on trial. And they come to the letter tau, and it says, curse Cadmus with many curses. Cadmus, king of Thebes, originator of the Greek alphabet, for introducing ta into the family of letters as a model for stauros, that vile engine on which men are crucified. So a stauros, a cross, looked like that. And you'll notice even the lower letter T, it didn't have part of the upright going above the crossbar. So that was likely the position. So from the patibulum, to stretch out, from the work with Dr. Barbet, it's most likely Jesus would have been nailed through the wrist because it will just more firmly and more easily hold him there. It's easier to get a nail down in those bones than into the kind of sloppy, probably dirty, sweaty palm that didn't have anything to really bite into. So one soldier would pull the arm out, pound that in. Another one on the other side will pull that arm, or another one pounds it in and stretch it out straight. Because you'll notice in Alcamilla and the other images, the arms are almost straight out. So that's probably what it looked like. It was nothing fancy, and it fixed him well. How were Jesus' feet attached? We don't know for sure. But it's amazing the evidence that we do have. We can assume nails. Nails were used in the wrist. Also in the instructions for undertakers, it talks about having nails. If you look at crucifixes, there's a lot of different ways that the feet appear on them. Side by side, one on top of the other, with this little block of wood under them, without a block of wood. There's actually no evidence that the little block of wood was used. What do the oldest images show? Here's another graffito, which is singular of graffiti, which I didn't know until about 5 years ago. Again, while crucifixion is going on, this is called the Alexamenos graffito, because in Greek here it says Alexamenos worships his God. So what's with this whole horse-headed thing or ass-headed thing? The pagan Romans believed that the Jews worshipped a god with the head of an ass. It's a long story. I won't bore you with it, but it is supposed to depict in some way the crucifixion of Jesus. What I want you to notice here is that the heels are the closest thing to the upright. Here is an ancient gemstone from 3rd century. Again, the heels are the closest thing to the upright. Here's another ancient seal. Again, the heels are the closest to the upright. And then you've got this from archaeology. In 1968, in a cemetery about a mile north of Calvary was found a 1st century burial place with a number of ossuaries. An ossuary is a box of bones. So in the Middle East, after someone died, they'd lay them out in this stone tomb on a slab. And once body decomposed, they'd take the bones, put them in a box, and label which family member they came from. And often there'd be maybe bones from 3 people in one particular ossuary. This was from a young man that they estimate was 24 to 28 years old named Yehohanan, and this is his right heel bone. So this is a mock-up of what it would have looked like, a nail going from outside to inside through the heel bone, the calcaneus. There was actually a piece of olive wood on the original that they discovered between the head of the nail and the bone. So it might have looked something like this. This is a cadaver without that piece of wood there. And it's been depicted like that in at least one movie of Jesus' life. Not a bone of him will be broken. And guess what? When you pound a nail through a fresh live bone like this, it doesn't break. You just put a hole in it. A second one was found 3 years ago in northern Italy in the Po River Valley. And they found another heel bone just with a hole, no nail. The reason the nail was in the first one is it bent, and they couldn't get it back out to reuse it. Otherwise, they reused these nails. But here's something odd. The wider hole is on the inside of the ankle heel bone, not the outside, which fits the Alchemilla Wow. Who would have ever dreamed of that? Now, I've talked to Barry Schwartz. You don't know Barry, but Barry was the official photographer on the Shroud of Turin research project. And he said that when you look at the blood flows on the feet of the Shroud of Turin, you really can't tell. The nail could have gone through the heel, could have gone through the front of the foot. People have thought front of the foot because they see it on crucifixes. Guess when the first crucifix shows the feet on the front of the cross? About 1,000 years after Christ. Relatively late innovation. So the pragmatic argument is how in the world, as a soldier, are you going to get a spike through this, and then through that, and then through the wood? I don't see it happening. I see this happening pretty darn easily. Once you've got the crossbar on top of the upright, then it takes one soldier to hold the foot there and another one to pound in the nail through the side. That looks pretty easy. The last thing I want to cover is this big theory that came out that Jesus died by suffocation. And this originated with a 70s song. Yeah, I heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend. You'd been messing around with something called Aufbinden. Dr. Barbet talked to a Dr. Hynek, who talked to a Dr. Lebec, who actually witnessed this kind of torture in World War I. And this is Aufbinden. This is taking the wrists together, pulling a victim up, and holding them with their feet off the ground. And what would eventually happen is they would cry Aufbinden, which in German means untie me, because they would gradually get to a state where they couldn't breathe and they would suffocate. And in fact, this doctor did studies with medical students with their hands held 40 inches apart. And what happened is after 6 minutes in this position, they get pale, they couldn't breathe very deeply, and then their muscles would start to cramp from top down. And by 30 minutes, they had to come down, otherwise they would pass out. And as we know from torture victims, they would actually die from suffocation. There's only one problem with this. This isn't crucifixion. With crucifixion, most of the weight is on the feet. Here, none of the weight is on the feet. With crucifixion, the arms are mostly horizontal with hardly any pull on them. Here, the arms are vertical. Now, in that original article Dr. Edwards wrote, and based on the work of Dr. Barbet, he had this drawing to show how somebody supposedly would breathe on the cross. And the theory was this, that with the arms up, the ribs open up, the lungs open up, and air rushes in. And so that to exhale, you'd have to bring your elbows back to your ribs to press the air out of the lungs. And in order to do that, you'd have to push up with all your weight on your feet, raise your body, and turn with the nails about there. And I have to admit, I swallowed even though it bothered me. The diaphragm is still working. And, I'd walk around like this for a long period of time. I'm still breathing okay. What am I missing here? And they would actually point to these two different blood flows at the wrist of the Shroud of Turin. See, that's the two different positions they were in when they were breathing. I used to teach this for 20 years. Oh, you know what? There's a lot easier answer. You can find it on your own wrist. Look, on the little finger side of the wrist, there's a bump there. It's called the head of the ulna. That's just the blood flowing around the head of the ulna. Much simpler explanation. And then this. Dr. Frederick Zugeby did studies with medical students. Fortunately, he didn't nail them to crosses. He strapped them. But he asked them, when you're in this position, okay, I want you to push up and straighten your legs. Push, push, push as if your life depends on it. Were they able to straighten their legs? Nope, not even once. Yet, if the suffocation theory is true, it requires that they did this thousands of times because crucifixion victims could live for days. In fact, Eusebius, who wrote the early history of the church in the 300s, said that they thought they died of, in some cases, starvation. And plus, in the ancient literature, which does talk about shouting, crying, or spitting from a cross, it never once mentions somebody moving up and down, having difficulty breathing, gasping or wheezing. And finally, the Gospels themselves. What did Jesus do at the moment of death? He cried out in a loud voice. If you're dying from suffocation, you're barely conscious and you're not able to make much of any sound. So it just doesn't fit. You can't do that if you're suffocating. And to tie it all together with suffering, I can tell you things that are objectively true about suffering, but the subjective part is the hardest. Why do I suffer? Sometimes we don't know. But these questions deserve good answers. But now there are some good answers. Where is God when children are starving? He's in them, starving with them. Where was God in the concentration camps? He was in the gas chambers, suffering and dying with those people. 9/11, he was in the towers, suffering and dying. So when we think, where is God when I suffer? He's in me, suffering with me. So how can I do better with my suffering? One way is his 3 steps. See something that looks like suffering as an opportunity for growth. Sometimes keep calm and feel the pain, and then take on the challenge, because suffering is useful. And those 3 little words that have been in Catholic circles for decades, the ones that husbands hear their wives say to them when their husbands are complaining, offer it up. Those are the 3 little words that mean the most, because that is our superpower. We can offer it up for the salvation of somebody else. St. Monica did it for what? 33 years for Augustine. It worked there. So like John Paul says, each man in his suffering can also become a sharer in the redemptive suffering of Christ. So exercise your priesthood, your lay priesthood. The essence of priesthood is what? Offering sacrifice on behalf of the salvation of others. And we have a part of the priesthood because of our baptism. That is your superpower. It has eternal consequences. And the secret of turning suffering into joy is not running from it, it's embracing it. This is John Paul II. This is 8 days before he died, embracing the cross, embracing his suffering on international live TV during the Stations of the Cross, 8 days before he died. Saints are the graduates of the school of suffering. Citizens of hell are dropouts of the school of suffering. Are you going to be a graduate or dropout? You must choose, but choose wisely. For the price of love is suffering. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes? Most likely, it was the loss of blood from all the trauma he endured, and you get into a state called shock. Low blood pressure, you don't have enough force to get blood into the organs that need it. And then that eventually, the heart beats harder and harder until the heart isn't getting enough oxygen, and so the heart starts beating too fast. The pacemaker of the heart is usually at the top of the heart. I think it can transfer to the bottom of the heart in the ventricles. You get something called ventricular tachycardia. It starts beating like 200 times a minute. before it stops. And when it's beating that fast, you feel differently. You almost feel like the life is leaving you, which gives us a natural way that Jesus would have known the end was near, so he could say the last two lines he said, "It is finished. Into your hands I commend my spirit." So probably a combination of traumatic shock and then a final heart rhythm abnormality where the heart finally stopped beating. And that's the consistent threads in all the doctors who have written about the death of Christ. Those make the most sense. Yes?
Do you know anything about why they would give victims wine and vinegar?
Oh, great question. Thank you. This was another thing I taught wrong for years. And they said, oh, well, myrrh has analgesic, pain-killing properties. Actually, it doesn't. It's been researched by alternative medicine people. It doesn't. And Mark says the wine was mixed with myrrh, which is odd because all the wine had myrrh in it, but just a tiny bit as a preservative. So obviously this wine had extra myrrh in it. And when you taste wine mixed with myrrh, and this is from Eric Koskaniemi, he was a Finnish theologian, wrote this article about 5 or 10 years ago. It tastes like gasoline, it tastes like vinegar, it's awful. So here you have somebody who is so incredibly thirsty, and then they drink something like that, it just makes their thirst worse. So it was a way to make the torture worse. Great question. Yes?
So if Christ didn't die of suffocation, the people were fighting that took their legs.
Yes.
Did they die from suffocation?
No, but that's very good. That was another reason, that was another supporting factor. See, once you broke their legs, they couldn't push themselves up. Like I said, I taught it dozens of times around the country. There was a nice article from the Journal of Emergency Medicine about 15 years ago, just talking about fractures of the tibia, the main bone of the leg, the shin bone. And when that bone breaks, you know, that's where a lot of your blood is made, is on the inside of bones like that. And so it was about how much blood loss you would lose. So you break one of those bones and the bone stays in the skin, you lose half a liter to a liter of blood. Average man my size has about 6 liters of blood. You lose 2 liters, it's all over. If you break 2 of those bones, you lose 1 to 2 liters. If you break them and the bone's sticking out, you lose 2 to 4 liters. Blood loss, just a rapid way to cause an immense amount of blood loss. Yes?
In regards to the piercing of the side, I think tradition has it that his heart was pierced as well. Do you think that was?
I think that makes the most sense, that his heart was pierced. So if we go, the Shroud of Turin gives us a location underneath the 5th rib on the right side. The right side of the heart only has to pump blood to the lungs, so it has thinner muscle than the left side of the heart. You had a buildup of that fluid in the pleural cavity, the space between the lungs and the chest. And so you have to have about a liter on that lung to reach the 5th intercostal space, which is pretty reasonable. Even if it were bloody, Jesus being died, the blood would have settled down and be a relatively clear fluid. Then it hits the right side of the heart with a thin wall. Blood is still liquid after death. So it makes sense that you had a lot of blood from the heart and a little bit of that clear fluid kind of around the edges coming out. So yes, that makes the most sense. I agree. I would like to give away 3 copies of my book, but I have to figure out who to give them to. So it's been suggested by several people that I ask trivia questions. You give me a category, I'll give you a question. Somebody give me, I'll ask everybody. Palm Sunday. All right, here's an easy one. So first one with the hand up gets to try to answer it. What do they do with this year's palms next year? Yes? Very good. You can come down for yours. I'll be happy to inscribe it for you. Another category. Yes? Biology. Ooh, biology. Yeah, if you get it wrong, you have to give me a book. No. Let's see, what would be a good question?